Okay, I think we're live now on Facebook and YouTube. Hello, everyone. I'm Steve Wernick, Rabbi Wernick, Reb Steve, one of the rabbis at Beth Tzedec congregation here in sunny Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And today's guest on Conversation Over Coffee is a new friend of mine, Lara Roden. Lara is a rising second-year student at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, and last year, her first year, she was the Tenenbaum Fellow of Beth Tzedec congregation. That meant that the end of the summer, she spent 2 weeks in our congregation. What she'll tell you is she spent a year here in 2 weeks at the end of the summer, and then she worked. The obligation was for a couple of weeks at Camp Ramah in Canada, but Camp loved her so much they hired her for the entire summer. In fact, they hired her for the year-round part-time to help develop what Lara and I are affectionately calling trail Torah, Torah of the environment, Torah out and about in the world, Torah that connects us with the world as it is created. So Lara, it's wonderful to see you again. Lara's also going to be with us for Rosh Hashanah, taking Trail Torah to Cedarvale Ravine to be working with some of our young people on Rosh Hashanah, and she's going to be creating the curriculum for Yom Kippur. Fortunately, she's not going to be able to be with us for that, but we'll get to all of that in a few moments. First, I think, Lara, we should say, you should introduce yourself. What are the most important things that people should know about you?
Thank you, Reb Steve. Thank you for having me here. It's so good to be back with Beth Tzedec after 2 wonderful weeks, which you're right, felt like a year back in June. It's really, really nice to come back after a summer at Camp Ramah, and it feels like home. It really does. So thank you for having me here on Conversations Over Coffee. Speaking of coffee, the first thing you need to know about me is that I am always caffeinated. So that's an important part of me if you want to get to know me. So I'm glad that this conversation is happening over coffee.
This is why I like you so much, because I'm always caffeinated too. It's like coffee is my biggest vice. And I'm a snob about it. I'm a snob about it. I don't like, don't give me these caramel, mocha, frappa, whatever. It's like, just give me a good cup of coffee.
Good black coffee. I'm with you. I'm so with you. The next thing that you need to know about me, and Reb Steve knows this, is that I love stories. I love telling stories. I love listening to stories. I love learning through stories. I think, honestly, that's what brought me to the rabbinate ultimately, was because I just found such good stories, so much richness in Torah, in Talmud. And that's what really, I think, inspires me to do this work of storytelling and story sharing and story reading and listening. And the last thing you need to know about me is that I love being outside. As a little girl, I would be swimming in a pool or a lake, or we'd go on a walk, or I'd be riding my bike around the block, even around my driveway, just over and over and over again, or I'd be playing in my backyard. And I was always the last one out, no matter what. I was the last one out of the pool or the last one in the house after playing outside. I loved exploring. I loved the growth and transformation that I experienced when I was outside playing and being creative. And I think those are the things that you really need to know about me in terms of my character. In terms of my past, I grew up here in Calgary, Alberta, where I'm sitting right now in my childhood bedroom. And I grew up here very involved in Jewish life and community. I grew up in day school, BBYO, summer camp. When I went off to McGill, where I studied Eastern religion and spirituality, I spent a lot of time at Hillel. And I was so invested in my learning about ritual, religious life. I found it so compelling, this idea that someone can return to a practice, whether it was a prayer practice, a yoga practice, every day, same time, same place, top of their yoga mat, perhaps, and feel connected to the people around them, to the world around them, to the divine, to God, connected to themselves. And I looked at my intellectual curiosity in these practices, and I just thought, Judaism, I'm Jewish. I care about the Jewish people. I'm invested in Jewish community. I know Judaism has a toolbox for this.
Look at that. It was here all along.
I know Judaism has a toolbox for this spiritual expression and ritual practice. And I know it's called Torah and Tefillah. And yes, of course, I've grown up in summer camps and day schools who have shaped my Jewish identity immensely. But I really wanted to unlock and access that Torah and Tefillah for myself. And I wanted to do that for other people. And that's sort of what brought me to this work, to learning at Pardes, where I studied for 2 years in Jerusalem and got a master's in Jewish education, and I studied Talmud there. And it brought me to Rabbinical school, to JTS eventually, and to Beth Tzedec.
So in those 3 years of really immersing yourself in the Jewish story, what are the stories that at this moment are resonating most with you?
I think since I'm still, I can't claim to be an expert in Trail Torah, as we're calling it, or in Wilderness Torah, but I'm beginning my learning, and I'm really finding a niche and a love for combining my affection for being outdoors, my desire for growth and transformation, for the growth and transformation and challenge and vulnerability that being outdoors brings, combining that with my love of Judaism. And right now, the stories that are really moving me are stories of Jews spending time outside in the desert, in the wilderness, right? Before we had the Beit Mikdash, before we had the temple, before we even had the Mishkan, which traveled, the tabernacle, which traveled along with the Jewish people throughout the desert with Bnei Israel, we had Har Sinai, we had Mount Sinai, right? Moshe climbed up a mountain, similarly to how I do in my daily life, climbed up a mountain and there met God, right? We had Yam Suf, the splitting of the Red Sea. We spent time with this natural body of water and had a deeply meaningful spiritual ritual experience. We spent time beside trees, right? The burning bush. I'm thinking about the burning bush and how that was, an environmental element which brought spirituality and ritual richness. So those are some of the stories of our ancestors that I'm feeling really compelled and moved by. And I don't picture a bush, lighting up and burning indefinitely anytime soon in front of me. I don't picture the sea or the lake that I'm swimming in at Camp Ramah. I don't picture Skeleton Lake splitting and having a spiritual experience in that way. But I certainly found this summer at Camp Ramah and in my lifetime that those natural elements of the world have a way of moving us.
It seems so much easier to connect spiritually with the divine when you're out in nature than it is when you're in the hustle and bustle of your daily life. I've been thinking about this for myself. I went on my first canoeing trip this year. I went for 3 days to Algonquin, and I'd never been camping like that before. I mean, when I went to Camp Ramah, as a kid, I went to Camp Ramah in Ojai, California.
They didn't have camping there.
They did have camping, but in retrospect, I think it was more glamping. I remember walking somewhere and then sleeping outside. It's like you didn't need a tent because it wasn't good. You weren't in danger of rain. We were in the desert, so it's not like, and I don't remember necessarily cooking for ourselves either. But so this, like you go up north into the provincial park, you take everything with you, you portage, you collect firewood, you set up your camp, and you just feel like you're in God's house. And I'm just like reflecting on this notion, like, are we diminished in some way as a result of the Industrial Revolution that moved us from being more connected to the land to being more concentrated in cities and industry? It seems like, when we go out into nature, we feel that divine presence. But when we're sitting here in our homes, we have to be so much more mindful of it. I mean, you can do it. Obviously, I believe we can do it. Otherwise, what business would I be in? But it takes more effort. It takes more effort, it seems, here rather than those peak experiences, as you said, as climbing the mountain or canoeing a lake, to feel God's presence. I mean, what are your thoughts about that?
You know what, Reb Steve, it's such a great point. And I think it's about balance. We can't escape that our reality is in this world, right? It's in our business and our school and our daily lives. Torah and tefillah need to happen in places like synagogues and schools, right? Those are spaces that are parts of our daily lives. But I do really believe that finding intentional moments to go outdoors and do that work too can only enrich our spiritual lives, right? It can only add to the fullness, to the totality of what we are able to experience. And I agree that it potentially for some people it's easier. I'm thinking even of some campers who were totally miserable on camping trips. They're crying because of the bugs and the rain. Maybe for them, actually, engaging outdoors is harder. But the point is to find different ways, I think, to challenge and to grow. And being outside and connecting to the natural world is certainly a way of building a more robust spiritual life and prayer life and ritual life. And I think two things really I'm thinking about Elul, the month of Elul, which is the month we're in now. When you said to dwell in the house of God, right? Being outside is to dwell in the house of God. It totally reminded me of a psalm we say every morning during Elul, Psalm 27. We say, Achat sha'alti me'et Hashem. One thing I ask of God, right, is to dwell in the house of God all of the days of my life, kol yamei chayai, right? Lachazot b'noam Adonai, to experience, to be in the proximity of the pleasantness of God, uvaker b'heichalo, or to visit God's sanctuaries, God's holy spaces, right? What are we talking about when we talk about dwelling in God's house every day of your life, of experiencing God's pleasantness, God's holiness? For me, I think about looking out my window right now. I think about the tallness of the trees, right? The greenness of the grass, the variety, marabu, right? How diverse and full of variety is the world. So I think for me that is one of the most powerful things. But of course, you're right. It needs to be combined with our practical lived realities, or else it's also meaningless. We need the balance.
And it's also a reminder why the Mishkan was so essential, even for Bnei Israel, when they escaped from Egypt and they're in the wilderness. They still needed a focal point where they could say, "This is the house of God." I mean, they're in the wilderness, but they still needed that focal point. I just recently prayed that verse, "Achat sha'alti me'et Hashem," with a member of our community who was so distraught that she's just hasn't been able to come into the building. And that's what she longs for. She longs to be in that sacred space, and to try to tell her that God is everywhere, which of course she knows intellectually. It's not the same, because human beings, they need that focal point. And so whether that focal point perhaps is a physical structure like a synagogue or a mishkan, some tabernacle where we focus our attention on God dwelling. And it's important to remind ourselves in the audience too, that when the building of the Mishkan, what's the reason that God gives for it is you should, asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. You'll create for me a holy place and I will dwell amongst them. And so the Torah even understands that the Mishkan is not for God, it's for us. So we need that dwelling place, that synagogue, that focal point, that where we come into that, perhaps we can leave all the worries outside or refresh ourselves so we can deal with them differently. But sometimes that focal point is going to God's house, is going out into nature. I know I certainly felt that in a different way this summer on my trip. And the congregation's going to be tired of hearing about it. That's the second day, Rosh Hashanah service. I'm curious, Laura, what are some of the ways that you experimented with Trail Torah? Tell us a story of some of the transformation and learnings that you had of taking our tradition and translating it for young people outdoors.
Oh, this is really my most favorite part of the summer, was getting to try on this Trail Torah. I went on a 5-day canoe trip with the oldest campers, the Elonim campers. They're about 15, 16 at camp. And I didn't really know them that well before we left camp. I knew that they were, to be honest, they were on the easy trip, quote unquote. Okay, there's a hard trip, there's an easy trip. They were on the easy trip. I knew that they didn't really want to be outside. They didn't really want to be portaging. They didn't really want to be canoeing. They didn't really want to be setting up camp. And it was the week of Parshat Ekev, actually, the week before Parshat Ekev. And in Parshat Ekev, we get a really famous line, an adage, a famous adage, and it says, by not bread alone, a man can't live on bread alone. A human being cannot.
That cannot live by bread alone.
Right, a human being cannot live on bread alone. Exactly. Okay. So what we had just been canoeing, right? We're paddling all day long. The teens are tired, they're exhausted, they're ready to pack up camp, and we pull up to our campsite. And it's this magnificent rock, like truly magnificent rock. And one of my teens, and I have to admit that she was like the teen who I would least expect to be enthused about the outdoors, and you can conjure whatever image you want of a teen who's not enthused to be outside. And we pull up to this rock, and she's in the front of my canoe, and she says to me, Laura, I think it's amazing that people can live on a rock. Like, all we're gonna do right now is pull up to this rock and set up a campsite here. We could live here. And earlier on in the summer, in order to take teens out on canoe trips, I had learned some wilderness first aid and safety. And I had learned, of course, that you really only need 4 things to survive, period. Not just in the wilderness, just anywhere. You only really need 4 things to survive. And those things are water, food, shelter, and fire. So I said to her, it is pretty amazing, right? That we could pull up to this rock and essentially live on it with only water, food, shelter, and fire. But then I looked at her and I thought about Parshat Ekev, which was coming up that Shabbat. And I said, but can we really only live with water, food, shelter, and fire? Can a human being really only live on bread, on physical sustenance alone? Any one of us who went to high school know Maslow's hierarchy, right? We know that, of course, those things sustain our physical bodies. They're at the basic level of Maslow's hierarchy, right? The first thing you need in life is to be physically sustained, and those things physically sustain us. So yes, it's so cool. We could physically be sustained on this rock for as long as we want. But what about the rest of us? What about our relationships? What about our spiritual, emotional, social beings? Those things also need to be sustained. And that's what Parshat Ekev means when it says that a human being can't survive on bread alone. And it opened up this beautiful conversation that we had on a canoe in the middle of a river, brought on by our surroundings, by our experience outdoors, but also brought on by the relationship that this teen and I were building because we were outside, because we were being challenged, we were growing, we were learning together. There was a sense of vulnerability, of intimacy that I think being outside with someone, portaging a canoe with someone brings along with it. And that was a really powerful way for me to learn Torah. And it really, I think in every situation, I can always think of a line, a pasuk, a verse in the Torah that I feel compelled to share in a moment of deep learning. And that was certainly one of them.
So was that Sur Yisrael that you found, that the Rock of Israel? Is that where you were?
Oh, well, there were Bnei Israel on it, so it could be.
So
another thing we did actually that I really enjoyed too, as part of our tefillah every day, was getting grounded in our senses. I brought in the idea of Havdalah, right? When we do Havdalah every week, when we are in a moment of transition between Shabbat and the rest of the week, we ground ourselves in our senses. We sniff the spices, we feel and look at the light of the candle, right?
Taste the wine.
We taste the wine, exactly. And I use that sort of every day of the canoe trip to think about how we are journeying and how we are in transition every day of our trip, every time we're outside. And we spent some time learning tefillah through those lenses. So one day was our hearing day. And obviously we focused on the Shema and its blessings. And we thought about what Ahava Rabbah, the blessing we say before the Shema, how the idea of lishmoa, lilmod ulilamed, the idea of listening in order to learn and then teach, how powerful and impactful that was. We did an activity where we sat outside and listened to the sounds around us, to the sounds of the leaves in the trees, of the water crashing against the shore. And then we did a little wilderness survival activity too. They were all in blindfolds, and we stood, my tripping partner and I, slamming sticks, and they had to sort of make their way over to us with a partner guiding them. And it was really a fun fun activity. Another day we did sight, and they spent time, we all sat in different directions. We talked about Ure'item Otam, when we look at our tzitzit in the blessings of the Shema every day, how the sense of sight can ground us in our values. And we all found a different spot and looked out at a different angle and spent 30 seconds describing to each other what we were looking at, really detailed, right down to the glimmer of the sun on the water. It was a really powerful way to experience tefillah in that lived moment.
I'm so jealous. I spent so many years of my career working with teenagers as a youth advisor, director, rabbi. I mean, I'm still working with it, but I'm now in this position. I'm a couple steps removed from directly responsible for it. But the same thing. It's like once you teach at camp, it infuses the way that you teach everywhere. When I was on the canoe trip, did something similar. It was like, Shema Yisrael is to really quiet your mind, focus on your breathing, and what is it that you hear out in the wilderness? Just the sounds of the water, of the wind, of the animals, the birds. Just that, when you hear things differently. When you're in the city, you hear planes, you hear cars, you hear somebody honking their horn.
Maybe you don't even hear because you're not
"No,
listening."
do you have a glass of milk? You hear different things. And then also, one of the most impactful experiences I had was in Israel. I was in Mitzpeh Ramon. There's this lookout point overlooking the Machtesh. We called it Camel Rock because it was in the formation of a camel. It looked like a camel, right? And you know what I'm talking about? Camel Rock and Mitzpeh Ramon.
Totally.
Right? So I remember I was there with a group of 15-year-olds, and the sun was setting. And I said to them, Hamariv Aravim, the evening prayer where evening rolls away, where day rolls away into evening, and the transition of time. And so our tefillah was just that one paragraph. And the idea was to sit silently and just observe the rolling away of day into night, and so forth. So as you know, and everybody else should know, is like, I'm a big fan of this notion of Trail Torah. I think Trail Torah is really something, and I don't think there's enough of it. What do you have in store for our young people for Rosh Hashanah? What are some of the things you're preparing for them? Just 2 weeks away already. I have so much work to do. 2 weeks away.
I'm thinking I have so much packing to do, because the day after Rosh Hashanah, I go from Toronto and move to New York to finally start rabbinical school in person. So I'm thinking I have so much packing to do, but I also have work to do. Some of what we're planning it's a little, not messy, but get your hands in the dirt. We're planning on day 2 of Rosh Hashanah, we'll be doing some work around the idea of Hayom Harat Olam, a tefillah, a prayer, which appears throughout our Rosh Hashanah morning liturgy. Spending time making some mud cakes to think and discover what it means to celebrate the birthday of the world. We are going to be outside in the park at Cedar Vale on Rosh Hashanah day 1 as well. We're going to be doing some activities around the shofar blasts. That's going to be a little bit more of a movement activity. We are going to pick up on Beth Tzedec's theme for Chagim, for the high holidays, of Panim El Panim, being face to face. We're going to do some gathering of leaves and of sticks and of some rocks and acorns, and building our own faces. So that's just a taste of some of what you'll get to experience if you join us on Rosh Hashanah morning, day 1 and day 2, for some young family fun.
What are you looking forward to this year in rabbinical school?
That's a great question. I'm really looking forward to being with my cohort. I think after a year of learning together on Zoom, these are people who are going to be my colleagues, my friends, right? They will be my spiritual well of knowledge, of support, on which I will draw often as a rabbi, I think, and to get to just sit with them around a Shabbat table or a holiday table and share a meal will be really special. So I'm looking forward to the moments that it will feel safe and appropriate to do that. And I'm really hoping that they'll come soon.
What classes are you taking? Who are you learning with?
I am learning, I'll learn Talmud with Dr. Lehman, who I learned Talmud with, Dr. Marjorie Lehman, who I learned Talmud with last year as well. And this year, I think Shabbat and Kashrut are up on the table. So we're a little bit more digging into some more halachic layers of Gemara, which is kind of a new realm for me. I'm used to the stories. So I'm excited for that, though I'm sure they'll be layered with plenty of stories. I'm doing some Midrash learning on the side with Rabbi Beth Tzedec, which is a really exciting opportunity for me to get to do because of how much I love stories. We'll be learning some Midrash Agadah, which are these rabbinic stories. The rabbis fill gaps in the Torah text by creating their own stories. And so I'm really looking forward to doing that learning as well.
I wanted to ask you in the time that's remaining, tell us a little bit about the way in which you see the Jewish world changing for you and your peers. What is it that we who are thinking about the future of synagogues and the ongoing progression, development of synagogues, what are some of the things that we should be thinking about that are important to your peers and the people who you hang out with that aren't necessarily interested in going to rabbinical school?
I really think that meeting people where they are is what any business is, right? Whether it's, Apple building iPods or iPads and laptops, or whether it's shuls marketing their experiences to their congregants. That's something that I learned actually from you as well during my time at Beth Tzedec, that whatever a rabbi is does not really only happen from the bima. I spent lots of time with you on the proverbial bima on Zoom, but much more than that, I noticed that it's about relationships. It's about knowing people, knowing where they are, where they're spending their time, what they care about doing in the world, what makes them feel excited or empowered, what makes them feel like they're giving to the world, like they're growing, like they have something to offer and to share. And I think that will be what changes in the coming years as the generation shifts and we have to sort of start to see where young people are spending their time. I certainly think outdoors is one of those places. Young people are outside. But I think there are lots of spaces and places where young people get excited about spending their time, and where older people get excited about spending their time. And I think it's all about building relationships and learning what people love and care about. Because as we've seen, there are ways for Jewish life to enrich those spaces even more.
Yeah. So your ordination certificate still is going to say that as you become a rabbi, you become a preacher, teacher, and judge in Israel. The reality, though, is that really, I think the job of the rabbi today is to be Moreh Derech, and that is a life guide. The teacher still makes sense, but it's about being a life guide. It's about being a Moreh Derech. How do you help people navigate the trail of their lives in a way that's filled and rich with meaning and purpose, and a meaning and purpose that comes from our Jewish tradition? A lot of people will say when they hear that, well, what makes Judaism different than anything else? And my answer to that is, first and foremost, Judaism is your way of doing this. This is our particular trail, and it's been traveled for centuries by our people. So we know that it works. We know that this is a tried and true journey, a system by which we can live a meaningful life. And that's what makes it special and unique. It's not the only. There are other traditions that are filled with meaning and purpose as well, but we have a particular perspective on how we deal with those things, and that's really the job. All right, Laura, we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks, and we look forward to following your rabbinical school career and seeing where you end up on the end of that a few years from now. Thanks for being our Tannenbaum Fellow. Thanks for your work at Camp Ramah. And thanks for your work at Beth Tzedec. May you have a Shana Tova U'Mituka.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thanks for being such a wonderful mentor to me. Beth Tzedec, it's really nice to be back here with you, and Shana Tova to you all too.
Want to say to everyone, please be sure to check out our website, www.beth-tzedec.org, to find out all the opportunities by which you can engage with Beth Tzedec for these high holy days, both in person and online, in person in Beth Tzedec, and also in person at the Cedar Vale Ravine with Lara, as well as with others. We have multiple opportunities that are taking place, multiple opportunities for people to be inspired and enabled to live a meaningful Jewish life. I want to wish everyone a Shana Tova U'Mituka. Have a good week. Thanks, everyone.